Okay, great. All right, here we go. Well, welcome everyone to Researching Black New Orleans, our kind of roundtable, kind of lightning presentation discussion today. Um, we are researching Black New Orleans, which is a team of collaborators from multiple universities, predominantly grad students, who researching Black New Orleans comprises one of three projects within Keywords for Black Louisiana, a digital initiative of LifeX Code, Digital Humanities Against Enclosure, which was launched and directed by Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, assistant professor of history at JHU, Johns Hopkins University, author of the award-winning book Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Kinship in the Atlantic World, incredible digital humanist in her own right and scholar of slavery. Here at Researching Black New Orleans, we kind of ask broadly, what does it mean to research Black New Orleans? What are the methodologies, the archives, the questions that kind of need to be answered? How have scholars approached the study of Black New Orleans, past and present? And our project is ongoing. Today, you will hear a kind of mini series of presentations about the work that each of us are doing. We join you here today from Johns Hopkins University, Tulane University, Washington University in St. Louis. So you'll get to hear a little bit about our works in progress. I'm going to type in the chat once I kind of finish giving an intro, the links to LifeX Code, in addition to our Twitter account, so you can check out the kind of various projects within it. I am going to briefly give introductions to everybody that will speak today, and then we'll kind of move in a kind of mini presentation lightning mode. So our first speaker today is Dr. Robin McDowell, who is an assistant professor of African and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Robin McDowell investigates the histories of oil and slavery in Louisiana using a transdisciplinary research methodology that draws on earth sciences, the archive, oral histories, art making. If you've seen or got to hear any of Dr. Robin McDowell's work, it's really, really exciting. She holds a PhD in African and African American Studies and an MA in History from Harvard University, and a BA in Fine Arts and Communication Design from the University of Pennsylvania. I'll give that introduction and we'll kind of go person by person, and then I'll introduce speakers as we go. So Robin, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Olivia. I'm going to share my screen actually with you all. Let me see. Okay, there we go. All right, there we go. Thank you so much. Thanks, Olivia, and thank you to my incredible teammates. And thank you all in the audience for coming with and being with us so bright and early. So my contribution to Research New Orleans is entitled Illustrating Black New Orleans. And it's an ongoing investigation of the circulation, design, and recontextualization of illustration plates in John Blassingame's canonical text, Black New Orleans, 1860 to 1880. And I follow the journey of about 35 etchings, woodcuts, and photogravure prints that first appeared in 19th century newspapers and magazines and made their way into the pages of Black New Orleans. So what does it mean to illustrate Black New Orleans? I'll start with some basics. John Blassingame's Black New Orleans had three printings. The first in 1973 from UChicago Press, second, 1976, a UChicago Press Phoenix edition. That's the one in red and the one I am using in this presentation. And then a 2007 reprint, also from UChicago Press on the left. The 2007 reissue back cover says it is replete with archival illustrations from newspapers and rare periodicals. And what I found were that the illustrations weren't simple accompaniments to Blassingame's already rich scholarship, nor were they actually directly referenced in the text. They told stories of their own, they have lives of their own. And so in doing this project, I thought a lot about a question posed by Toni Morrison, which is, how can I say things that are pictures? And I wondered what can be lost and gained, created, obscured, possibly even violated between saying and picturing. So to meditate on this, I'm going to show you two of my favorite pieces so far in this project. So first is this illustration of two young people, and one appears to be reading to the other, and it's anything but a static image on a page. It's actually a collage, and each child was cut out of a larger scene, also in the book. And in fact, these two scenes, these two wood engravings, printed side by side in the May 1872 issue of Harper's Weekly. So take first the illustration on the left. Blassingame captioned it as a father's guidance, implying that a father was patiently teaching his child to read. However, according to the Harper's Weekly article, it was meant to depict a school child reading the newspaper to his father. So the direction in which the teaching flows tells two really different stories about access to education, literacy amongst enslaved and formerly enslaved people in New Orleans. And another story, which is perhaps more important or really transcendent, is one about the domestic lives of Black New Orleanians, the tenderness of intergenerational exchange that's not just father and child, but the women framing the scene as well. And so next, the other child was taken from this image that Blassingame captioned entertaining the family. Again, a gesture to domestic life, tenderness, and pleasure. Yet, the Harper's Weekly article narrated it in a derogatory manner. None of them appear to take any thought of the future or any interest in anything but music. It also mentions, as here zoomed in, that this was on a plantation, likely not in the metropole of New Orleans. And to add another twist to the journey of this illustration, Blassingame's text for this accompanying chapter to these illustrations discusses the weaknesses and burdens of the Black family after the Civil War. But do these kinds of inaccuracies or slippages between the text and image, the same image and new text, the same text and collaged images, do they spoil Blassingame's narrative? Does the cutting and recontextualization of the children defile the subject matter? Or is it taking an illustration out of the context of a magazine published for white consumption? Does it present an opportunity then to retell the story of a Black New Orleans family life in a way that even Blassingame didn't intend? Because the children on this page, in a way, then have left their homes to read and listen to each other, to read to Blassingame and read with us. So as you can see, there are many layers to interpretation here. And what's interesting to me are the conversations between them, the saying and the picturing, because often in between is where precious things hide, which then brings me to my last example here. It's called the cakewalk, and the images was used on the front and back covers of the 1973 and 1976 version, the cover page, and in the text. And actually, here's just one interesting thing. In the 2007 reprint, it was pretty sliced and distorted. And in each place, it's rendered in different styles, different techniques. This one was first printed in the January 1899 issue of Frank Leslie's newspaper as a full-page spread with no accompanying article, entitled Close Competition at the Cakewalk, a popular pastime of the colored people in which many white persons manifest great interests. Upon close examination, this print was created using a photograph that appears to have been cut out and placed on a blank sheet. And then the shadows were hand painted and reproduced as a photo gravure plate. What was the original background of the cakewalkers? Why cut it out? Why publish a full-page spread with no article? And this context, as well as geographic context, right, is absent in Frank Leslie's, but in Black New Orleans, this is placed above several pages of text describing parties, fashion, opera, travels to Paris that upper-class Black people enjoyed. So then this image, placed in Blassingame's text, transforms this dancing competition that originated on plantations, meant to both imitate and amuse wealthy whites, to an illustration of physical, social, and economic mobility, perhaps, within an urban, even a transatlantic geography. And so last, the most lovely and haunting surprise came from this illustration. On the cover, it's split into 3 pieces, front, back, and spine. And I began to try to piece this together into one, like this. And this didn't match. And why? Because in this cut and paste choreography, a woman went missing. But here she is, dancing through 120 years, 3 printings, book glue, paper pulp, and printing ink. And now on my screen. And I'm so pleased to meet her. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Next, we have Keith Richards. Keith Richards is a second-year PhD student at Tulane University, where he studies urban spaces in the 17th century Caribbean, with a focus on Cuba and Spanish Florida. His interests include public space, expressions of power, cartography, and urban resistance to colonialism. Welcome, Keith.
Hi, thank you so much, Olivia, for the introduction. Thank you so much, Dr. McDowell, for that very good presentation. And I look forward to hearing from everybody else, as well as from the discussion that we're going to be having after we've all presented. So myself, Andrew, Chris, and Dr. Adderley are working on the Black New Orleans project, which, like Dr. McDowell's presentation, is centered around John W. Blassingame's seminal text, Black New Orleans, 1860 to 1880. So the book is a very good survey of Black life immediately after emancipation and through Reconstruction. So we as a class, because this is for Dr. Adderley's African American culture class, that's going to go well beyond the scope just of that class. We are going through the book. While Dr. McDowell was looking at images, we're looking directly at the text, and we're hoping to kind of better understand it and hopefully find new contexts. So we're going through all of these chapters and looking for place names, people names, institution names, publication names, and we're putting them into, at the moment, Google Sheets, which I'm going to go ahead and pull the curtain back and show you guys an example of the chapter that I did work on. So this was for chapter 5, which is on education, the question of integration or segregation in schools, Black educational institutions, and then literature to a lesser degree. So as you can see up at the top, there are a bunch of different categories that we're looking at. Things like place names, institution names. But as you can sort of see, this project is still in its very early stages. And so there's not everything is filled in, but we've gone through every single chapter of the book and we have all of this information. So you can see just the wealth of information that we've been able to collect here. And the end goal for all of this is to take every citation that we have and attempt to fill in as much of this information that we possibly can have, so that we can then put it into ArcGIS, which is a digital mapping tool, which we're hoping to then be able to have a better idea of what Black New Orleans was. When Blasingame, of course, wrote this, he didn't have that map that we're kind of discussing here. So the sorts of connections that you can make are incredibly different whenever you're thinking of the city, instead of through the written word, instead of these analog means, we're instead thinking of them through digital means and through more visual ideas, which is something that I think is really important as someone who is very interested in urban space, the ways in which we depict the city. It's very difficult as a reader, as someone who's not a scholar like Blasingame was, to be able to read all of these things that he is discussing, all of these neighborhoods, all of these general, like relative locations of it's across the street from Audubon Park. Not everyone knows where that is, but everyone's able to look at an ArcGIS map and be able to make these connections that otherwise might not have been able to be done. And I think also that it will allow us as scholars to take all of this information and be able to recontextualize it, because these are going to be visualizations that Blasingame himself might not necessarily have been able to have drawn just by not plotting these things onto a map. It's a new way of taking his information and then seeing what exactly it is that was happening. How are people moving across the city? How are these ideas circulating? His sort of idea is a little bit different than what our scope is going to be, but I think that it offers a very good jumping point for us to better understand it. And so while we have all of these terms, there's going to be additional steps that we're taking. So each group that's been doing these chapters are going to be trying to fill in all of the additional boxes of the Google Sheets in order to sort of fill everything in. But we're going to isolate just one chapter for this semester just to make it manageable. And so in my case, I'm going to be driving around town, basically looking for what's there now, because nearly a century and a half has passed since the end of Blasingame, since the end of his book, 1880. And so the city is completely different from how what he's discussing was. And so we're sort of looking at a layered geographical space where we're looking at both the past, but we also have the opportunity to see what the city's like now in those same exact spaces that he was discussing then. Is the Black New Orleans that he's discussing, did it still survive in any way into the present? Has it changed? How? And what does that tell us about how the city has changed over time? I think that it's very important for us to be able to recontextualize how the city changes over time. And I think that ArcGIS can sort of facilitate that in a way of making these broad connections, as well as being able to then place it and recontextualize it into the present day, so that we see the city's evolution and changes, and whether these spaces are reproduced, maintained, or have structurally changed, and what that tells us about the city as well right now in the present. Thank you guys so much. I look forward to hearing everybody else's presentations.
Thank you, Keith. And I just want to say I have very bad Wi-Fi, which is why I'm turning my camera on and off, but I'm here. Thank you, Keith. Next up, we have Maya. Maya Overby Koretzky is an MD/PhD student at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in the History of Medicine department. Maya holds a BA in history from Cornell University and completed a fellowship in bioethics at the National Institute of Health prior to matriculating at Hopkins. Previously, Maya worked on the history of interracial organ transplants and the early history of the HIV epidemic at a public hospital in San Francisco. Maya's dissertation project is a history of Charity Hospital in New Orleans from the 1880s to the 1940s, with a focus on everyday life, patient experience, and the historical origins of social determinants of health.
All right. Hi, everyone. Olivia, thank you for that introduction. And just in general, it's such a pleasure to be on this panel with everyone. And it's really great to be hearing from people at Tulane as well as people from our own institution. So I love that we've been able to do this collaborative work. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some work from my own dissertation project that I think connects to this theme of archiving and how we get at sort of everyday experience, Black experience in New Orleans. And particularly, I'm interested in the limits and the uses and limitations of institutional history for understanding everyday life and Black life. So as Olivia mentioned, my dissertation project is on the history of Charity Hospital, and in particular, I'm looking at a time period that's a little bit later than the one that Blassingame covers in his work. And so today I'm going to reflect a little bit on how my dissertation work intersects with these themes. And I have a few slides that hopefully will help illustrate my points. And I have not screen shared on this platform before, so if there's an issue, we'll address that, I guess. But just bear with me while I try to get the slideshow going. Okay. You guys can't see that, can you? Like, there's no screen share? Yeah. I've been having some issues, and I think it's my permissions in Firefox, and I think that means I'm going to have to leave the meeting to screen share. So, Robin, I'm wondering if I can just send you the slides I wanted to show, because I know your screen share works. If you're there.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Mine happened in a session yesterday. It's
okay. Maybe I will Slack Robin real quick. I'm really sorry because I know we have limited time. The images are kind of important, I think, because I'm talking about different kinds of records, and I just wanted to show you some like examples of them. So what I'm going to do is I will give my slides to Robin, and if she's able to share them, that's great. And otherwise, I'll just sort of talk about it. So just one second. Okay.
This is like a normal in-person conference. Things break virtually and in person.
Yeah.
I think we tell ourselves that it's the venue, but in fact, you know, we could be standing in a poorly appointed hotel room and the audio not work. So.
Yeah, it's okay. I just put my slides in our group Slack if anyone is able to screen share them, but I can also just sort of talk about the project without them. It's fine. So I apologize for the technological hiccup. If you're not familiar, I think most of the people in the audience are people who work on the history of New Orleans, so this is like not news to you, but Charity Hospital is one of the oldest hospitals in North America and treated patients throughout the state of Louisiana who could not pay for medical care. Oh, great. Thank you, Robin. Awesome. And yeah, so these are two pictures of Charity during the time period that I work on. Obviously, it's had many different buildings, many different incarnations. And the patients who were treated at Charity were not uniformly Black patients, but many of them were raced as Black. So all we have is the medical records claims about race. We don't necessarily have patients' own identifying claims. And I'm particularly interested in the lives of these patients because they represent a demographic that's sort of difficult to access historically because they didn't really leave much of a paper trail beyond what records exist in the hospital. And so it's sort of a different image of Black New Orleans from the one that comes up in Blassingame's text. And I think that Andrew is going to talk a little bit more about that sort of dichotomy in his presentation. So Robin, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So the Charity Hospital Archive is sort of uniquely difficult to work with. It's very fragmented, but it's fragmented in a way that I think is historically instructive and sort of highlights a lot of issues, or not issues, but a lot of sort of underlying structural connections and disconnections in archives that a lot of historians work with, but sort of in the New Orleans context and in the context of Charity Hospital, these disconnections are just more obvious. And so as you can see, I sort of created an image that encapsulates all of the different places that records from Charity Hospital appear in New Orleans today. So there's like formal records that you can see at the public library or in the state of Louisiana archives. And then the medical school archives, LSU and Tulane, tend to have different sort of standard operating procedure, manuals, clinical cases, like things like that. And then I also didn't put it on here, but UNO has a big history of nursing collection. So there's a lot of sort of schools, professional schools that have records. And then there's also sort of the physical footprint of the hospital itself in the city. So this is a picture of the Charity Hospital Cemetery. And then famous physicians who worked at the hospital also have their papers in places like the Louisiana Research Collection. So creating the archive means sort of like following this web of different paper trails. And then if you can go to the next slide, Robin. So it's sort of also the hospital archive is on this continuum between formal and informal records. And the records are sort of, the different levels of records are divided a little bit in terms of where they are in the city today. And I think that this is very typical of a lot of institutional archives. So it's like, I don't want to just be making a claim about my project. I want to talk about sort of the limitations and the uses of institutional history as a way to get at lived experience. And so one of the difficulties is that many institutions, the kind of records that are kept are these sort of formal records. And then the informal records, which are things like ephemera or material history or scrapbooks, or like handwritten little notes, like in the margins of patient notes, like that stuff, the hospital just doesn't care about keeping as much as it cares about keeping these sort of formalized records. And so it's a challenge to sort of find things that are on this spectrum. And I think there's a very productive tension for the historian in thinking about the different kinds of records that institutions produce and like what's lost in the gap between these different kinds of records. And so we'll just go to the next slide. Thank you, Robin. So I just want to talk a little bit about, this is just one example of what I mean by this sort of overlapping between formal and informal records and how that can be instructive about both lived experience and also the limits of the archive. So this is an admission ticket, which is like just a sort of intake record for a patient in 1935. So obviously a lot later than what some of the other panelists are talking about, but I think there are some really important historical continuities. And so you can see all of the information that's contained on this really small 4x6 index card. It has information about where this patient lived, about what ward they went to, their age, their race, again, not self-identified, and their religion, who referred them to the hospital, the kind of disease that they were experiencing, what the outcome of their care was. So there's all this information here. That's also really interesting sort of demographic biographical information about this person who probably otherwise does not have a documentary record of their experience. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of missing information in this card. And I think some of the missing information is as interesting as the information that is here. So there's different categories of missing information. On one hand, we just have the initials of the typist. And so that's sort of like information that would have been assumed knowledge at the time and that's just been lost. So like at some point, someone knew who E.T. was, but that information has just been lost. And then there's missing information where there's things that just were not filled out on the card. So you can see that there's very little information about what actually happened during the hospital admission on the back of this card. There's nothing about previous admissions, although I can tell you that this patient actually was admitted previously. So it's like not actually all, it doesn't all line up. And then there's also information that the card itself doesn't ask for. And so I think that's actually the most interesting silence here, is that the form itself, by showing you what sort of information physicians were interested in, also shows you like the limits of the archive that is produced by the hospital. And so, you know, there's nothing on here for any sort of extended history of present illness or family history or social history and that sort of thing, like that sort of more thorough biographical information, or even like a history behind why this person was pregnant and how they felt about the pregnancy. All of that stuff is like not included here. And so it's really important to think about where we brush up against those silences. And Robin, you can actually skip the next 2 slides and just go to the one that's the Scrivener one. Yeah, this one. So I'm trying to go a little bit quicker because I want to make sure we hear from everyone. I'm happy to go back and talk about some other approaches that I've used in the archive. I just want to talk about one sort of approach that is building on what Keith was saying about digital history and the sort of affordances or possibilities of digital history. So I think one of the things that's really important about working with archives like this that have these like deliberately created silences that are sort of actively working against the project of recovering lived experience and Black life is to have archives that make space for that silence and also make space for that possibility. So when you're in the process of taking source material from the paper archive to the digital world, it can be very easy to just sort of replicate the same structure as the paper archive. And that structure itself has a history, and that structure itself is erasing. And so I've started using Scrivener, which is just one tool. I think there's a lot of different tools like this. Scrivener happened to be like the cheapest and most accessible for me as a graduate student. But essentially, it's like a program created for fiction writers where you can sort of make each, you can make, in this case, each primary source or each collection of primary sources that I'm using has its own like index card. And these cards that are all different colors can be moved around in whatever order and can be sort of organized and stratified on different themes instead of in a static organization like in a Excel spreadsheet, for instance. And each one of these cards also, this is a static photo, so I can't show you, but if you clicked inside it, you could see my notes on each one of these sources. So there's this sort of 3-dimensional depth to the way I'm trying to arrange these sources as well, in a way that does not sort of flatten them the same way that the archive does. And you can see on the bottom that there's space in Scrivener for metadata. So like, for instance, the record that's selected, I said, was sort of related to architecture, medical education, psychiatry, and it was an administrative document from the hospital. And so each one of these records has that metadata, which is like another way to organize and think through it. And so having the ability to reorganize records is something that's really important in the digital world and is something I'm still thinking through. So I'm excited to think through it with all of you guys. And that's it. So thank you again, Robin, for sharing the screen. I really appreciate everyone who dealt with our little tech hiccup. And yeah.
Thank you, Maya. Next up, we have Andrew. Andrew Miller is a first-year PhD student in history at Tulane University, where his research focuses on slavery and slave resistance in the Gulf South in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Maya, for that presentation. It was very insightful, I thought. So like Keith sort of introduced what we're doing with Professor Adderley at Tulane. We're sort of going through John Blassingame's book and sort of digitizing and plucking out all the data that we can. And one thing that's interesting about Blassingame is that he, well, the book was published in 1973, and he was very clear that because he was looking at 1860 to 1880, which is, of course, the Civil War and Reconstruction in New Orleans, that he didn't want to deal with the political history, which had been covered extensively by previous historians. He really wanted to look at the social lives of Black New Orleanians in this period. And so it's a very good resource for people who are interested in the social history of that time. And that time itself is very, as I'm sure you all know, is very dynamic in terms of social history, because the Black population of New Orleans more than doubled in those years. So going from the Black population in 1860 was about 24,000. By 1880, it was 58,000. And that was due largely to a very large influx of people from rural areas, mainly English-speaking people, most of whom had been enslaved. And so when they got to New Orleans, they're coming into contact with then more established, largely French-speaking population that Blassingame refers to as the Creole population. And he really sees a stark social divide between the English-speaking and the French-speaking groups in the city. And for my part of the project, I looked at chapter 6, where he really gets into these issues. The title of that is Social Life and Problems. And he sort of divides it, most of the chapters looking at, obviously, the social lives of Black New Orleanians, like leisure activities, social organizations that they created, Black newspapers. And he presents a really full and fascinating picture of what I would say is sort of the elite Black life in the city at that time. And sort of as a afterthought almost, he also looks at the non-elite, which is sort of falls under the rubric of like crime statistics, health statistics, poverty statistics. And I think it presents sort of another way of thinking about some of the themes that Maya was looking at, what we preserve in our historical accounts and what those accounts leave out. So to give you a little insight into exactly how we're going about this project, we went through chapter 6, looking, as Keith said, for places, people, institutions, any sort of proper noun that's in this chapter, and that yielded 235 entries, or I guess rows in our spreadsheet, and of those entries, about 62% were of people, either individuals or families. And the bulk of these, I would say probably 80% of these are what Blassingame calls social leaders. So people who, and he defines this very specifically, people who hold a certain number of offices in different Black organizations in the city. And so he divides those very strictly between the French-speaking and the English-speaking populations, and he gives, paragraphs of just names, which, as Keith sort of mentioned, it's hard for a lot of readers, I think for any reader really, to use that information in a productive way. Just a block of names is kind of hard to assimilate. And so what we're trying to do is take those names from this analog source, digitize them, and then what we can do, Keith mentioned ArcGIS, which is a very powerful tool. There are also other programs that can map social networks, so that, you take a name, you add on as much data as you can about it. Where did this person live? What were the organizations they were a part of? Once you do that, you can start to map the social networks, like who else was a part of that organization, who also lived in that neighborhood. And by doing that, hopefully, down the road, we can start to recreate and visualize what these networks look like. And I think that's a very powerful tool because, for example, we could maybe be able to test, Blassingame sees this very clear division between the English-speaking and French-speaking populations. Was that really the case? Once we map their social networks, maybe there's more overlap than he thought. Or maybe there's even less overlap than he thought. Maybe it's an even starker divide. So I think that's one of the really valuable ways that digital humanities can improve our understanding of the past and complexify things. But then I also need to point out sort of the other side, which gets to sort of Maya's presentation, which is that because Blasting Game does focus so much on elites and social leaders, there is the other people in the city, the other people who make up Black New Orleans are silenced, are sort of left out of this equation. For example, he mentions in chapter 6 a group of very poor Black New Orleanians who raised over $1,000 in 1865 for an orphanage, but he doesn't give the names. So when we map to these social networks, those people are left out. And so the flip side of digital humanities is that just because you digitize something doesn't mean that you're suddenly improving or, you know, remedying all the problems or silences that might be contained in that source. And so I think we obviously have to be aware of that, and we also have to think about the ways that we can supplement the data that we do get from these sources. And I think that one of the really exciting things about digital humanities is that it can create potentially sort of an open source history where we are, by gathering this data, by digitizing it, publishing it, you know, on the internet, we can open that up to other people to add, to sort of address these silences, and to involve the community in a way that, you know, spaces like this, you know, academic conferences or academic journals are often obviously not reflective of the communities that they're studying. And so I think that the digital humanities can kind of help to bridge that gap. And that's a little bit what we're trying to do with our project. So I'll throw it back to you, Olivia.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, so I guess it's my turn. My name is Olivia Barnard. I am a PhD candidate of history at Johns Hopkins University, where I research slavery, white womanhood, and their intersections in mid-18th century Louisiana, focusing mostly on New Orleans. As a scholar of the 18th century, I've become increasingly interested in the histories of the institutions that hold the archives that are near and dear to our work here, but my work too as well. The bulk of the records that I use right now live at the Louisiana State Museum, which opened in 1906. This was, of course, in the wake of the rise of the historical profession, history with a capital H, at the end of the 19th century, and in the kind of actual immediate wake of the centennial celebration of the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana State Museum, you know, which functions in tandem with the Louisiana Historical Society, which first formed in 1836, kind of modeling itself after Northeast historical societies. Both of these kind of institutions, societies, kind of make me think about networks and people throughout the 20th century and the kind of building of these institutions. So my contribution to researching Black New Orleans is thinking about these institutions and their rise, the power and the funding awarded to them, and the ways in which Black historians of Black New Orleans navigated within and beyond these institutions. My work for this project has brought me into different archives throughout the city, from the Amistad Research Center to the University of New Orleans Special Collections, where, you know, pages of correspondence between scholars of Black New Orleans give insight to the kind of networks formed between them, the disagreements, the support lended to one another, and just kind of how everyone was figuring out where everything was in the wake of institutions kind of figuring out what they had at the same time. So today, you know, for the short presentation, I want to talk about kind of two major concepts that we talk about a lot within researching Black New Orleans, one of which is the archive, sources, and the other is methodology. And I want to talk about both these things through the work and life of Marcus Christian. a historian of Black Louisiana, a poet, a creative writer, a bibliophile, a folklorist, a printer, and so many other things, a lover of French Quarter pecans, which is what I've discovered from reading many of his letters. His archive is full of, letters from graduate students, independent scholars, colleagues, people everywhere who seek him out during, the kind of mid 20th century, starting in like the 1950s, following the work with the WPA through the late kind of 20th century, because they know that Marcus Christian knows where all of the sources are in the city. And so he's a key interlocutor, across institutions, but also just for people. Often someone will get a letter, someone working at Dillard, someone at the Louisiana State Museum will be asked a question, and rather than kind of answering it, they will redirect that question to Marcus Christian. And to kind of put this in context with the conversation we're having about John Blassingame's Black New Orleans, John Blassingame sent Marcus Christian his dissertation prospectus, his dissertation that would become Black New Orleans, and later sent him a manuscript kind of copy of it as it was slightly before it was heading to publishers, but kind of as the time was coming, the time was nearing, which I can't find that version of the manuscript, but I do know that Christian marked it all up and promised that his notes were in pencil, so that way Blassingame could erase them all. The first kind of concept, the archive, right? So we're thinking about the 20th century kind of rise of these kind of white historical institutions, the societies, how they're gaining traction in Louisiana and throughout the US. And thinking about that in tandem with the historically Black colleges and universities in the city, like Dillard, who are kind of amassing their libraries at the same time. We often think of course, Dorothy Porter Wesley, the extraordinary historian and archivist, who was responsible for kind of organizing and administrating the inaugural library for Negro life and history, now the Moreland Springer and Research Center at Howard University, who spent 43 years over the course of the 20th century creating this library, turning it into a modern research library with materials. We've read the stories of Porter Wesley urging colleagues to bring collections and materials to the center, often saving and keeping things that others wanted to discard. And while we know these stories and we think about the kind of places where sources are coming from, manuscripts, books, things like that, Marcus Christian's archives opens up another kind of network for thinking about how resources are getting into these institutions, how people are kind of getting hold of things. And that is actually the rare bookstores in the French Quarter on Royal Street. Kind of during the 1930s, the 40s and 50s, Christian's archive reflects a kind of a large amount of correspondence with different booksellers, often urging him to come to the shop quickly before new material is sold. For example, on December 18th, 1941, Mr. Adolph Arthur Silverman wrote Christian to tell him he recently acquired a, quote, large collection of slavery material, all manuscript and every one a Louisiana piece, end quote, adding that even if Christian did not want to purchase the collection for himself or for Dillard, which is at the time, Christian's also kind of trying to build up the Dillard Library, but he urges him to get someone to purchase it who will allow him to have access to it because he says that it will be very important for his work. A month later, the same man, Mr. Silverman, writes Christian about the 3 volumes of Histoire de la Louisiane, which is a 1758 manuscript by Antoine Simon Lepage du Prat, who is 1758 manuscript, which is vital for historians of colonial Louisiana, thinking about sources that many historians use. And so this bookseller actually writes Marcus Christian and says, hey, I need my 3 volumes back because Marcus Christian has taken them home to copy them on his printer at home. And so there's kind of evidence of him doing that in the archive, finding ways to kind of get materials within his possession within the library at Dillard, but also, as you can imagine, kind of within this network of people that he is communicating with and researching with for all of his work that is about Black Louisiana. So in addition to that, he's talking to someone named Paul F. Veith, who is another bookseller, kind of moving around during the 20th century, sometimes in Central City, sometimes in the French Quarter. He writes him often about books, and there's letters also in his archive that show that Dorothy Porter Wesley, for example, is also writing to Paul Veith in the French Quarter. There's evidence that people at Fisk are also kind of involved in this network. This is all things I'm like slowly trying to piece together, but hopefully within this project, thinking about what the digital world can offer us is some sort of map or kind of meditation on what this network of booksellers and Black historians, Black archivists throughout the kind of South, but also, based in the Northeast or wherever else, what this would look like digitally. And the kind of other thing that I want to talk about today, I know it's like an abrupt transition, is methodology and thinking about the methodologies used to research Black New Orleans, again, kind of in this 20th century moment as these institutions are being built. From his work on the WPA, we know that Marcus Christian is grounded in all kinds of archives and sources. The kind of magnum opus of his career, the Negro in Louisiana, that is. The footnotes are very long, is what I'm trying to say. It's filled with, newspaper articles or and other sources. And also, we know that Marcus Christian is involved with oral histories and is constantly, at least through his correspondence, emphasizing the importance of oral histories within the historical record. And this kind of brings me to his 1970s kind of work, which results in this manuscript, Negro Ironworkers in Louisiana. And so when he's writing that book, he is writing to various historians of Louisiana architecture, like Samuel Wilson Jr., who is kind of involved with the Louisiana Historical Society, a kind of independent scholar, Leonard V. Huber, who's kind of amassing his own collection of Louisiana manuscripts in his home. He's visiting the notarial archives. He is in touch with Boyd Cruz at the recently formed kind of Williams and Kemper collection, the historic New Orleans collection as we know it today. And basically, saying, I have gone through the entire archive and I'm still not finding the Black ironworkers that I know are there, despite the fact that, I have kind of various records of evidence, but I'm not finding what I need. So what he does from that moment on is that on May 6, 1971, on July 17th, 1971, he sends a letter to the want ad section at the Times-Picayune, a leading New Orleans newspaper. In the letter, he acknowledges how in the past, the relationship between him and the Times-Picayune has been a little bit fraught, because throughout his life and career, he constantly writes the Times-Picayune critically in opposition to many of the articles they publish about Black Louisianians or Black New Orleanians. So he writes and says, jokingly, "They do say that it is a long road that has no turning. Now I am appealing to your good graces to see if you can help me out of a difficulty." And what he does is he attaches to this letter a 20-word advertisement that says, quote, "Calling all Negro blacksmiths. Research worker desires specific information on Negro blacksmiths in Louisiana, especially during 1870 through 1915." Followed by his name and his P.O. box and the office phone number at University of New Orleans, where he is at the time. As other scholars kind of working on this subject, as his letters kind of allude to, there is no kind of effort to work in relation in the way that Christian is attempting to do so with this work. He's not writing about, some disconnected past. He wants to talk to the people who know the history. And what happens after this is that people immediately write to him from throughout Louisiana, from Franklin, Louisiana, from St. Francisville, from New Orleans. A daughter of a blacksmith, Mr. Elijah Dillon. Her name is Mrs. Eleanor Mossett. She writes, she's living just steps from Dillard University, and she writes to him about all of the photographs she has of her father in his blacksmith shop. Those photographs make it into the book. Kind of the end of the book ends with this kind of meditation on the letters and the words that he has gotten from people that he's been in touch with throughout Louisiana. So I just kind of want to leave us with these kind of two things, the archive and the methodology for thinking about this rise of kind of 20th century historical institutions and the ways in which Marcus Christian, for example, is very much in tune with what is happening within these institutions and using the resources to his advantage, and also working beyond them in a way that is, I'm slowly kind of starting to piece together within the archive, but in a way that brings a lot of people together in the city, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But yes, thank you so much. And now we will have Dr. Laura Adderley speak, who is an associate professor of history at Tulane University in New Orleans. Oh, sorry, Chris. My bad. What I meant to say is that now we'll have Chris Plunkett speak, joining us from the Tulane team. Chris Plunkett is from New Orleans, Louisiana, and got her BA in French and History at Louisiana State University. She is a second-year PhD student at Tulane studying Civil War memory.
Thank you, Olivia. So I am from Team Tulane. We are cataloging Blassingham's book. And not only are we trying to plug it into a map to physically see like the social networks and where is everything, but we're also trying to create a supplemental tool for the book by keywording everything. So he obviously has an index, but we want to create an index that does a little bit more for researchers. So one of the problems that we've already run into that Andrew mentioned was, one, we're limited by what's in the book. And so if he only mentions the social leaders, which do tend to be the upper class, the people with wealth and extra time to put into social work, then that's what we're left with. The other problem that we've run into is a lot of the people on Team Tulane are white, and we don't want to be reproducing the archival silences from the whitewashing of history. We don't have any answers, unfortunately, to how we prevent that, but it is something that we're conscious of. And it's something that we talk a lot about in class, sort of the pedagogy of how you create an archive like this, because the archive, the database isn't for us, actually. It's not intended for our use. It's not something we're using for our research papers later, in fact. It's really meant for an unknown audience. So when you're keywording, you can't just go by, oh, well, how would I want to re-find this specific data point? So for example, does a newspaper count as an institution? Or is that a completely separate tag for publication? We decided to put an institution to really keep it pretty easy to find things later. But then we wanted to keep in the keywords, well, newspaper. And then do we know it's a white-owned newspaper, or do we know it's a black newspaper? Well, that then has reduced us down to literally black and white. When Blassingham is very careful to mention, we have mixed race people. We have people who are Creole, which doesn't necessarily indicate race, indicates more culture. That's really hard to identify unless he tells us. We have no way of knowing someone's identified gender or sexuality because it's not mentioned. So those sorts of things are conversations that we're having. And so in a way, the database is meant to constantly be updated. And one way that we've made sure that that's possible is Dr. Adderley made sure that the first thing we did was create a little contact page. So every keyword that's put in actually has the person's name. And so you can find an email and say, hey, what did you mean by this? Or, let's add something here. So there's a sense of accountability to the project, which is really important to us because we're not perfect. And part of the class is learning, well, how do you even do this? And that's why, as Keith mentioned, we're only doing one chapter, completing the database with all of the different sections. Which is ambitious and it's hard, but we've broken it up into different sections. I'm on Team Proofread, which is great. But it's a fabulous project. It's really exciting to be a part of, but it leaves a lot of questions. Fortunately, we have Dr. Adderley here, so I'll send it back to Olivia.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris. And yes, now we have Dr. Laura Adderley, who is an associate professor of history at Tulane University in New Orleans. Professor Adderley works primarily as a comparative slavery historian, focusing particularly on the 19th century and the era of slave trade abolition and emancipation. Dr. Adderley is the author of the award-winning New Negroes from Africa, Slave Trade Abolition and Free African Settlement in the 19th Century Caribbean. And Dr. Adderley is team leader of kind of Team Tulane, or what they have dubbed themselves the Black Cultural History Project at Tulane within Keywords for Black Louisiana.
Thank you all for having me. This is so exciting. And so
Oh, wait, Dr. Adderley, you're on mute.
Am I still muted? Aye.
I can hear you, Dr. Adderley.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yes?
Yes.
Excellent. This is designed to be a roundtable, and I'm shocked at how many people, I'm grateful for both how many people and a couple of local scholars and teachers that I know that have showed up for our discussion this morning. So I will keep my comments fairly brief, more as discussion to this exercise, but also want to give a little bit of background to the relationship between the Life Code digital work, being a part of this Researching Black New Orleans team, and how it has literally changed the context and content of a seminar I have taught for, and I see that Larry Powell was in the audience. He can probably tell me this better than me, for about 20 years. I teach African diaspora history at Tulane. Somebody in the early 2000s wanted more actual cultural history taught. There was a little bit of course development money. And to be honest, what they meant when they said cultural history was that I think that they essentially thought about music and art and sort of material cultural production, and that they felt that in a place such as New Orleans, this should happen. But we could do more, we could do with the courses we developed as we chose. One of the things that engaging with this project has done for the seminar is that I have never taught the class as kind of a run-through narrative of, musical or other cultural forms. But engaging with this project and with the archival practice, and I think the Keith and Chris and Andrew who are in the seminar now, they perhaps cannot hear this. There is a radical difference to the way discussions have gone in two very specific ways that I think speak to the ethos of Researching Black New Orleans, and how actually getting deep into the archival practices of the authors we are reading changes how we approach the Black people we are studying. Thing number one, and anyone who works in African American history knows this, is that there's always a risk, because of the sheer political and social force of white hegemony, that discussions that are supposed to be about Black communities turn discussions of North American race relations and of colonialism and sort of Black people who are the victims and the oppressed of those processes. They don't disappear, but they get lost in a certain way and they get talked about in a certain way. And by engaging in the work that the Tulane team has engaged in, it has changed conversations. More of the conversations of the seminar live deeply inside Black communities, and tried to figure out, as both Keith and Andrew really highlighted, to think about networks in those communities, not just through the reading of Blasting Game's texts, but actually it has shaped the way we have talked about the books that we have talked about. And that is not a product of my sort of social engineering, meaning that I did not set out to do that. It actually has oriented the brain of the group to the practice of John Blassingame and of this Life Code team researching Black New Orleans. And it is an interesting thing to watch. And I think one worthy of us thinking about in terms of researching Black New Orleans is that, unlike some previous generations of African diaspora historians, I know that for the past 25 years, at least, the understanding that the Black population of New Orleans is quote unquote important That's easy work. All right. I arrived in the profession after that was at least accepted. But how we approach that population is something that we can still do a lot of work with. And Olivia's work, Robin's work here gives us one, I think, clue that I want us to think about is to think about the actual origin stories of the records and Maya's as well. The things that I was thinking about in terms of what is going on here, the origin stories of the records we are using. We have a number of scholars in this audience and a part of this project. And I'm thinking here, I think I saw Sophie White out there. It's so odd to see the chat on one side. And obviously Jessica Johnson, but Larry Powell is here in terms of finding the people the colonial archives are not focused on, particularly those very rich notarial archives in terms of drawing out their voices from those well-known archives. But I think this project really encourages us to sort of, to what are the, either to use Andrew's language, what are the other layers or the other levels? And I'm not sure whether it's layers or levels I want to think about, because I don't want to create a hierarchy of information going on in the origin stories of the records that we are using. And it is, the archival turn in our profession is interesting, but I think this project is a lesson in how it can be even richer. Like, being self-conscious about the reading and creation of archives is step one. What we are trying to do in this work, what all of the scholars here on this roundtable are trying to do, is how do we actually complicate that practice in the case of New Orleans? But I think that there are lessons here for how we think about how we practice as historians in general. I am super interested, and I have the luxury of commenting. I actually want to talk much more hear more with Robin about how the woman that is now found, how she got lost. Because I do want to talk about that, because Olivia touches on that. It's both about the origin stories, but also what gets misplaced when. And if we could think about some of that in our roundtable discussion. I think that is perhaps a small point. The second thing that I do want us to think about and talk more roundtable style about is what is it that we can learn and show with not just with the digital tools themselves. Obviously, John Blassingame, could not map and distribute electronically in the way that we are attempting to do. And it is also easier, as Andrew pointed out, that there, in addition to just both the power and simplicity of ArcGIS, there's countless other tools out there that allow us to think about networks in a way that literally changes the way we think, not just the way we display. But if we can think more about what it is that we can actually know by having these tools, not, it's both what we can know, what questions we can ask, what we can show. I would, and I'm struggling with, as I was sitting here listening, with an important point that several of you raised in terms of who is still excluded. All right, both on Maya's point that even when you're looking at records that are remarkably rich, if someone said, I think that there's a different way of doing Maya's presentation that says, isn't this amazing that I have these charity records where essentially very ordinary Black New Orleanians of limited means, that I can know a great deal about their arrival at the hospital on an, unimportant evening in 1930, whatever. And Maya has sort of flipped that on its head and said, what is not here? What does this incredibly rich record not tell me? But also, how can I reorder it and human center it? And that is one of my obsessions. But thinking about what Keith and Andrew and Chris have said also about what we're doing with Blassingame's text, what do the tools give us, all right, about sort of literally thinking about these things in new ways? I thought really resonant, and I think Andrew brought it out, that like we just take it as an article of faith, what, the rough contours of sort of Anglo-Black New Orleans versus sort of Francophone Black New Orleans that has a slightly different origin story. What new questions can we ask about their interaction? On that point, I do want us to think about what we mean when we say Black New Orleans. And we've spent a lot of time in seminar talking about what the idea of scare quotes Black community means, and to think about that both as a I'm under the, thanks to Layla Blackbird, who's on a part of this team, re-educating me about the work of Andrea Mosterman, who's very deeply at University of New Orleans, is very deeply interested in spatial history, not just in terms of the geography of a city like New Orleans, but the actual spatial history inside people's homes. Who are they physically interacting with and in what circumstances? That I think there's an enormous potential with the work of this team and sort of reapproaching the archives with, sort of literal geographic questions that changes what is in many ways an easier question about, like, you could guide anyone through a discussion of the various ways that Black community has been defined intellectually. And understanding that, like, that there's a national one, that there's one that is defined by class. But thinking about that in actual spatial terms, like, what are we talking about when we talk about Black New Orleans? Literally, what and who are we talking about? I think Andrew's point is well taken, and I'm thinking a lot about Myers records and other records that many of us, certainly that Olivia is interacting with, in terms of how do we access people who are not race leaders? What does elite mean, and sort of how high and how low does that go? And the opportunity of what we are engaged in here is enormous. The last thing that I will say before we open it to more general discussion is that there are lots of elements of this that are literally only possible because we are functioning as a team, not just because of the sheer volume of it, but also because, as Chris said, none of us is perfect, and we bring our own subject position to it. And I love the the fact that in the case of what we're doing with John Blasingham's text this time around, that we actually literally have team proofread that says, what did you mean when you said that was an institution? It's a team. We had a huge discussion over what did it mean to call a publication also an institution. And intellectually, there's a way in which we're not taking the thing on its own terms or the way it presents itself. But for us to think about what collaborative work means in our practice as historians, but also in people trying to do a massive reconstruction, small r, of what Southern history means, what Black history means. I will leave my thoughts there. I forget how much time we have, but I do want us to have some chance for any of you to respond, but also for, I don't know if I see questions appearing in the chat. And I'm going to have a little peek at those because I'm not, sort of in terms of a little bit how we shepherd this for roundtable discussion, because it's not a panel where people are like, I have a question for Robin McDowell. I did have one question for Robin McDowell. How did the woman get lost? But thank you. I don't know if any of you want to respond. I am peeking through to see if there's anything that is actually, I know Fern and Eaton actually has a question. About the Charles Hartman collection at Xavier. Some at New York Historical Society, some in Mississippi, and some in Texas. And actually, maybe Olivia, Robin, any other you might be able to speak to that. We actually are focused in the city of New Orleans, but things that are of this record. And Maya and Olivia both mapped archives. What happens when it leaves the city? And I don't know if we've stretched our wings in that way.
I think that. Sorry, Olivia, it looked like you were going to say something. I'm going to back up.
I'll be quick because, one thing is that I have not actually yet been to the Charles Hartman collection in response to Fern and Eden, but I do know also that Charles Hartman was a bookseller and kind of a rare book dealer, and the kind of history of that collection makes me think about kind of parallels between the kind of collections that Marcus Christian was seeking out throughout his career. But to kind of speak to, I don't know, maybe archives leaving, there is a really interesting kind of anecdote within the archive. The president of the Louisiana Historical Society in 1945, I forget his name, but I should know that. But he amasses a collection of manuscripts, a lot of which are related to like the Lafitte brothers, the so-called pirates. And Marcus Christian is writing to John Hope Franklin about how this collection exists and how he can access it at, this man's house. And the point of it kind of moving around is that today they actually live at UT Austin in the special collections there, and that is where they ended up. So thinking about kind of the archive literally leaving the city with the family of the president of the Louisiana Historical Society after his, after he died, and then ending up at UT Austin, no longer being in New Orleans. But go ahead, Maya.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, I'm not familiar with the Hartman collection itself, but in regards to Dr. Adderley's point about archives leaving the city, I think, one resonance that I saw amongst all of our presentations was this idea that the sort of afterlife of the archive, like what happens to it after the information is produced, is like also an important part of understanding that, like what the archive conveys for a historian. And so I think it's like, at least in the work that I'm doing, material that leaves the city for a purpose. So like I'm thinking about like patient cases that are presented in the New Orleans Medical Surgical Journal and then get picked up in like other, like the American College of Surgeons had a journal that was like just in its infancy, but was circulated nationally. And like some of these same cases end up in that journal too. And then they end up in these places that are sort of foundational to the institution of American medicine. But then by the time that they get there, they're sort of stripped of the details that would make the cases sort of recognizably New Orleans, recognizably Black, recognizably about like patient experience. So there's like a process of silencing that also comes with moving outside of the city. And I think that Olivia sort of is dealing with the same themes in terms of thinking about how like Black historians of Black New Orleans were sort of navigating the world of speaking to like American history generally, and then also speaking to one another and speaking to like the practical experience of like these blacksmiths, for instance, in your anecdote. And so I think that sort of outside-inside divide is like a really fruitful place to explore. Just that like when things leave the city, and also when things come to the city, they come to the city for purpose. So that's the other thing, like Charity Hospital, in some ways, I wonder if it's actually an archive of New Orleans or if it's an archive of Louisiana, because a lot of the patients did not come from New Orleans, especially in the time period that I'm looking at. And so then what does it do to sort of allied these things where you're like considering the experience of Northern Louisiana people, and you're sort of aligning it with the experience of the Black New Orleans community that, has such a rich and unique history. So those are just a few thoughts.
I will say too, with our seminar, one of the, I can't say enough how honored I am to be working with this team of graduate students, those that are here, and the folks at Hopkins, so hardworking. Is one of the things we've been struggling with is what are the boundaries of even New Orleans, and that I don't know if anyone on this current team who are also transcribing some labor records that were actually come from a cotton factor or some kind of capitalist thing, that is riding a train out to what is now St. John Parish to sort of see what's happening with his money. And one of the things happening with his money is essentially, literally how much work in the late 1800s are mostly African Americans, but to Maya's point, occasionally sort of poor white Italian immigrants. Essentially, how hard are they working to make him New Orleans money? And there's a story of him and his enterprise that is about the attempt in the late 1800s by white elites to regenerate the city's economy. But then long before we have the easy currency that we now have between Orleans and St. John the Baptist, but he was out there all the time on the train, and interacting with this working community in a certain kind of way. So at any rate, so that's one piece of the story going on here as well, in terms of what that, like, is Charity a Louisiana story? And I was wondering, Robin, I don't know if you know with the illustrations, like when do what illustrations come to quote unquote stand in for African Americans taken out of their, like, and we talked a little bit, and like just when we were getting ready to do the citations about look at the illustrations, like is that actually New Orleans, or is that somewhere else? And I don't know what the 19th century history or the sort of late 19th, early 20th century history of having certain kinds of images come to stand in for some. I know a little bit about that in slavery era, but I don't know if Robin could say something to that.
Sure, absolutely. And you got at definitely the comment I was going to make, right, about these, that idea of movement of data or even movement of material, right? And that all of those, or almost, I think actually all of them, even some of the illustrations specifically depicting New Orleans, in which you can tell were created by illustrators and artists out of primarily New York and Boston, some out of London, right? So, there's a certain, right, circulation and economy of pretty much white male journalists, sometimes and illustrators coming down on steamships too, on like 19th century Louisiana tours in a way, that are then going back to New York. Maybe they've been commissioned, right, by Harper's or Frank Leslie's, come back, do illustrations, write the accompanying article for then maybe even an international audience, right? And then they're even doing, stand-in images. And then those images are coming back, right, in the 70s to Blasingame, but also up to the designer in Chicago on the press, right? So then all of these things that may have originated from someone experiencing, something on their commissioned journalism trip have now circulated, and then end up in Black New Orleans, right, in the 70s, which at that point, right, it's been everywhere, so it's in New Orleans, but also about a world economy of images.
Mm-hmm. I wondered if one of you might want to take on, because I don't want to lose it and I forget what our official time window is. Michio Yamanaka has a wonderful question about what we're going to do with Blasingame's statistical data, or statistical data generally, which is something that because it's, in some ways it's complicated, as Keith pointed out, to sort of how you map an institution or a location, because locations change. But this question is about how you're going to use Blasingame's or other statistical data in similarly innovative ways, whether you can map it and not sort of set that aside as, well, that can't be visualized, or we can't. And I'm wondering, we actually, for the purposes of the start of this project, it's chapter 4, I think, that is the densest one with numbers. And we literally set it aside and said, we'll think about that. And I don't know if anyone on this team sort of has thoughts about that, because it is the people, place, institution tracking is in some ways it is simpler in terms of thinking about what can we do with archival information. But I don't want to, and as someone, it is in the mid-19th century that governmental and other entities just start, hoovering up statistical data and leaving it behind for us. What we then do with it as we try to access particularly Black New Orleans community. I don't have a good answer, but maybe someone here might.
I think they're right. The statistical data in the book is really rich and could lead to a lot of productive research. One thing that really interests me from the chapter I read, because he's looking also at crime and stuff like that, he specifically points out that I think it's the 4th Ward or somewhere where there's a high crime rate, that he says a lot of those people worked as stevedores or as longshoremen on the docks. And so or as, boat captains or working on the ships. And so they were often gone. And he says that's why maybe there's not a strong connection to the community. And But in the statistical data, he breaks down how many people worked in those professions. And I think there is an opportunity, maybe like using census data where you sometimes have occupation and whatnot, to try to bring those people to life. Like, who specifically are these people that are living in this particular neighborhood? What can we find out about them? You know, he sort of reduces them to a criminal element, but obviously their lives are much richer. And I think that's one way you can sort of try to use that statistical data to put human face on these things.
Yeah, I think that you sort of have to, because whenever we're thinking through this project, if it's just plotting them on the map, then it's still not giving us the full picture. The city itself is a historical agent in and of itself that is facilitating meaning in these people's lives. And so we need that data to sort of flesh it out. I'm trying to think through how that would actually function, but I don't think that just saying, okay, like this place was this institution, I don't think that that's necessarily enough. Trying to capture those lives, and Andrew had mentioned it in his presentation about the silences, about like the working class folk that, you know, contributed to Black New Orleans without necessarily being named by Blasting Game. And so whenever you have all of these statistics, that's at least getting us closer to that picture that Blasting Game is able to mention, but isn't able to fully give identity and agency to.
I do think Andrew makes a really important point, is that numbers are both small and large, but it is possible if you have certain kinds of numbers now, you know, if there are 65 stevedores, you can at least make an effort to sort of think about what that means in practice and who they might have been. And there's a lot mass by volume of numbers. There's a great conversation going on in the chat about where Blasting Game's full numbers are separate from what ends up in the book. And I think it very much relates to the ethos of this project, which in many ways we're about the business of creating potentially digital and visualization and other kinds of tools that will accompany narrative histories, or that, as Chris said, that the audience, like, you know, it's not us as readers. We're not creating a helper tool for readers. We're actually creating tools and bodies of data and visualizations that will have their own life and that will have to sort of speak. And, you know, and there still is, and it's one of the data that underlays any narrative claim has its own identity. And as Robin pointed out, like, the press made choices about those illustrations. Blasting Game made choices about about the data, even where he gives us a lot, all right, about what he gives us.
I think I want to add to this that what he chooses from the sources is selective, as all historians do that. But what I found from kind of my ventures of going back into the text is the ways in which the sources that he did use are a wealth of information beyond, you know, the data that he kind of pulls from it. I'm thinking of one particular example that I love of. He's talking about, it's the chapter, I think it's chapter 5, about the kind of elite Black politicians and kind of like lawyers and businessmen within New Orleans. And he's listing, he's kind of talking about PBS Pinchback's home as an example of this, just the kind of leading design, all of the things that kind of are a part of social life within Black New Orleans. And he kind of pulls this information from a newspaper article, but also in that article is a kind of anecdote where the interviewer is kind of sits in the house, and all of a sudden Pinchback's daughter, who is like 4 years old at the time, runs in and kind of takes up space in the room. And there's kind of reflections on where you could go from that. So my point just being that there's so much in the sources still, I think, that even indexing those in ways that we are is so helpful in thinking beyond just the data that he's bringing to the table. But I do think that it's time to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank Dr. Adderley, Dr. McDowell, Keith, Chris, Maya, and Andrew for being a part of the presentation. And of course, thank you to Dr. Johnson, Jessica Marie Johnson, our leader and director at LifeX Code. And thank you all for coming today. If anyone wants any final words, feel free. But again, you can check out our work at lifexcode.org or find us on Twitter.
Thank y'all. This was fabulous.
Olivia, do you happen to know if our information is accessible through this platform? If anyone wants to follow up, or should we put our emails in the chat?
I wrote the LifeX Code on Twitter in the chat, but yeah, feel free. I don't know the answer, honestly, so I feel like writing.
I mean, I think one of the greatest things about conferences is the ability to have side conversations afterwards and see connections between people's work. And that's one of the things that's the hardest to replicate virtually. So I will put my email in the chat, and I feel like anyone else should also, and I know we're over time, so.
No, and I was thinking about that, and there is a networking tab. I do have some digital conference friends that I only know by dint of having met them digitally over the past year and a half, which is remarkable. Like a human I've never met that I've been at multiple conferences with. I need to talk to you about phone exchanges too, because I used to know an archivist who could look at records, and if they put the phone exchange, she could almost tell you the block. Like in the phone exchange, the number. And Harriet Merle, she was the Episcopal Church archivist here, and she's like, "Oh, if that's the exchange," and she was like, I have no idea who, and that's an early 20th century piece of information for thinking about your work.
Yes, we should talk, Dr. Adderley. I think a lot of these things that are institutional knowledge that's been lost are actually not lost. I just need to figure out who to ask. So,
So.
All right. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye, everyone.